Today's hearing is on an egregious and continuing problem. Communist China's illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive actions, also known as ICAD, in the Indo-Pacific. You'll first notice the deliberate use of ICAD, coined by our Filipino friends, rather than gray zone. This isn't just semantics. Gray zone allows Communist China to muddy the waters with regard to its intention and its involvement. It's purposely trying to hide what it's trying to do, and gray zone allows them to be able to do that. ICAD dispels this ambiguity and allows for more appropriate responses. It is time to call out Beijing's behavior for what it actually is. It's illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive. In April, as Senator Coons mentioned, he and I and Senator Budd saw Beijing's firsthand ICAD conduct on full display on a CODEL that we took to the Philippines and Taiwan. On a P-8 overflight of the West Philippine Sea, we witnessed firsthand the sheer scope of Chinese illegal violation of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Communist China uses the full spectrum of ICAD measures to try to turn the West Philippine Sea into a Chinese lake with Beijing's illegitimate and illegal 9-dash line and undermining Philippine people's will to resist. Xi Jinping has referred to this as the smokeless battlefield that will allow Communist China to win without fighting. Thanks to the tireless work of the Philippines, his hostility has been publicly documented, making it impossible for Communist China to deny or for the world to ignore. However, despite the reputational cost, Communist China's dangerous aggression continues. In August, we saw 2 Chinese vessels collide as they belligerently tried to ram a Filipino Coast Guard ship near the Scarborough Shoal. While this was a reckless and embarrassing event for Xi Jinping, it could have been much worse, particularly if there was a fatal collision with a Filipino vessel. This could have triggered our mutual defense treaty, with the Philippines, and started a war. Rather than appreciating the severe risks of its aggression, Communist China has instead doubled down. In addition to continuing to ram ships and shoot water cannons, Communist China has resorted to political lawfare, recently declaring Scarborough Reef as a nature reserve. Let's plead clear, this is within the Philippines' EEZ, not Communist China's. In Taiwan, the story isn't any better, as my colleague just highlighted. Taiwan continues to endure disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, bans on Taiwanese food exports, undersea cable cutting, violations of airspace and exclusive economic zone, and increasingly larger military exercises simulating quarantines, blockades, and evasion. Under President Lai, Taiwan has taken critical steps to strengthen its resilience to Communist China's ICAD behavior, including increasing national level planning and conducting civil defense exercises. But Taiwan still remains particularly vulnerable to coercion. This was evident in a tabletop exercise that Senator Coons and I held with Mr. Singleton earlier this year, simulating Chinese pressure campaign targeting Taiwan's energy. While Taiwanese and U.S. defense planners are right to prepare for a PLA invasion, a more immediate risk might be that Communist China will use its ICAD tactics to destroy Taiwan's ability to push back. If we are to successfully neutralize Chinese ICAD tactics targeting Taiwan, it is clear that more needs to be done to bolster Taiwan's whole of society resilience, military preparedness, and level of international support. Concerningly, Beijing's ICAD playbook is not confined to the West Philippine Sea or the Taiwan Strait, but is now being used throughout the region. In February, Chinese warships sailed through the Tasman Sea and circumvented Australia's coastline for more than 3 weeks. They staged unprecedented live-fire drills in a show of force meant to intimidate and stress test Australia's ability to respond. Communist China is also increasingly militarizing the Yellow Sea, installing dual-purpose platforms in disputed territory with South Korea. Similarly, Beijing has stepped up construction of drilling rigs and other platforms along the median line with Japan in the East China Sea, while it conducts a record number of Coast Guard patrols around the Senkaku Islands. So why does all this matter? To steal from Mr. Powell, as Sun Tzu said, the supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This is right out of Sun Tzu's playbook. To be able to win, the greatest general never fights a battle. He defeats his enemy beforehand. Ultimately, Communist China would rather act as a python, slowly squeezing countries to resist rather than acting as a cobra and striking quickly. Communist China's ICAD tactics are central to this effort, or at the very least, they can provoke a kinetic response and give Beijing a pretext for self-defensive military action. The good news is we have allies and partners who are bravely confronting Beijing's ICAD behavior, but they are currently overmatched. The United States must do more to even the scales and strengthen their resilience. Ranking Member Coons and I are working together to do just that. We introduced the Taiwan Energy Security and Anti-Embargo Act, which would facilitate increased American LNG exports to Taiwan, encourage cooperation with Taiwan on nuclear energy use, and ensure commerce with Taiwan continues in a contingency. We also introduced the Porcupine Act, which make it easier to quickly send arms that are critical to Taiwan to respond to and deter some of Communist China's ICAD activities. And finally, we recently introduced a resolution honoring the 75th anniversary of the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty to ensure Communist China knows that the United States will continue to stand by our ally. But more needs to be done, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses to understand the evolution of Communist China's use of ICAD tactics and what the U.S. and specifically the Congress can do to combat them. And so we will now turn to our witnesses. We will ask our witnesses, keep your oral testimony to 5 minutes, please. And as a reminder, your written testimony will be submitted to the official record. Our first witness today is Craig Singleton. Mr. Singleton is a Senior Director for China and a Senior Fellow at the Nonpartisan Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on great power competition with Beijing. A former U.S. diplomat with nearly 2 decades of service, he has worked extensively on China, North Korea, and the Indo-Pacific security. He also lectures at Stanford University on Chinese grand strategy. With that, Mr. Singleton, the floor is yours.
I'm pleased to offer policy insights from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan research institute where I serve as a senior fellow. Today, China is preparing for a conflict it hopes never to fight by slowly engineering the conditions for Taiwan's subjugation. This is not a distant or hypothetical problem. It's happening now. Beijing's ICAD playbook is calibrated to be incremental and ambiguous, carefully designed to avoid tripping U.S. red lines while steadily degrading Taiwan's confidence in its future. In China's calculus, Taiwan must eventually conclude that resistance is futile, that capitulation, not confrontation, is the only rational choice. Beijing interprets vulnerabilities not only in Taiwan's defenses, but also in U.S. and allied responses as validation of its approach. To date, sustained coercion below the threshold of war has not triggered decisive action. Instead, it has generated debate, delay, and uneven responses rather than unified pushback. This perception emboldens Beijing, which views ambiguity and hesitation among democracies as exploitable gaps in deterrence, gaps that reinforce Beijing's conviction that time favors its strategy. One challenge is that deterrence, as traditionally understood, does not map cleanly on the problem China has created. Deterrence by denial, building enough military power to block an invasion, and deterrence by punishment, threatening retaliatory costs, both falter when the contest unfolds in the gray zone. Equally critical is resilience, Taiwan's ability to withstand and bounce back from sustained pressure without losing confidence in its future or faith in U.S. support. Our job is to flip China's logic, proving that Taiwan's society, economy, and partners can outlast coercion, that Taipei can get back up after each shove, and that Beijing gains nothing from dragging out the contest. But increasingly, gray zone coercion is no longer a low-risk strategy. The more ships and planes Beijing surges around Taiwan, the higher likelihood there is for an accident, collision, or exchange of fire. What looks like slow-motion strangulation could just as easily become a sudden shock, a crisis that neither side intended, but both must confront. While Beijing has many avenues of coercion, one vulnerability stands out above all others: energy. Taiwan imports nearly all of its primary energy, and about half of its electricity now comes from liquefied natural gas. Its storage depth is thin, barely 10 days for LNG, meaning even temporary disruptions could cascade quickly into political and social pressure. To stress test these risks, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies conducted a series of energy quarantine tabletop exercises in Taipei with Taiwanese officials and experts, and in Europe and in the US with public and private stakeholders. The findings were sobering. The exercises revealed how Beijing could exploit Taiwan's dependence by combining limited interdictions at sea, cyber-enabled disruption of energy infrastructure, and political disinformation, squeezing confidence without firing a shot. The lesson is clear. Energy is not just a technical vulnerability, it's Taiwan's Achilles heel. So what should we do? Congress has a critical role in closing the deterrence gap. 3 priorities stand out. First, help harden Taiwan's resilience. That means supporting efforts to diversify energy imports, strengthen cyber defenses around critical infrastructure, and build redundancy into Taiwan's power grid, ports, and defense supply chains. These are practical steps that make it harder for Beijing to exploit choke points, and they buy time in a crisis. Second, strengthen allied and private sector signaling. Beijing counts on insurers, shippers, and markets to walk away at the first hint of risk, cutting off Taiwan's lifelines through commercial caution rather than open confrontation. Congress can press the administration to coordinate with allies on maritime insurance backstops and reflagging options, so trade with Taiwan continues even under pressure. Third, make clear that coercion will carry costs. Congress can advance sanctions tools that target Chinese entities complicit in quarantine operations or cyber-enabled disruption. This doesn't mean threatening war. It means ensuring Beijing understands that coercion against Taiwan will trigger coordinated countermeasures. The goal is simple: to ensure Beijing concludes that coercion, whether slow-motion strangulation or sudden shock, will fail. That's how we keep the peace, and that's why this committee's leadership is so essential. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you again for inviting me to testify today.
The People's Republic of China is this century's most successful expansionist power, one that directly threatens U.S. interests in East Asia. While Russia's territorial aggressions capture headlines and trigger responses, it is actually China that has quietly achieved far greater imperial successes in the maritime domain through its mastery of gray zone tactics, or what we now call illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive or ICAD tactics. Yet the United States has still not even articulated an effective counter-ICAD strategy. We are decades into losing a gray zone war we largely don't recognize we're supposed to be fighting. For over 50 years, China has systematically seized effective control of vast ocean areas through patient incremental expansion. Its campaign began with direct military action, with its 1974 Paracel Islands battle with South Vietnam, but has since evolved into sophisticated civil military tactics that have multiplied its gains across maritime East Asia. In blockading, occupying, and militarizing key maritime features across the South China Sea, Beijing has demonstrated strategic patience that has consistently outmaneuvered our outdated and inefficient response mechanisms. China's tactics extend beyond conquering reefs to include intrusive Coast Guard patrolling that establishes its claims of jurisdiction throughout its neighbors' waters in the South China Sea, around Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands, and in the Yellow Sea. Beijing also deploys oil platforms and aquaculture rigs to normalize administrative control over new areas through economic activities that also complicate countermeasures. Beijing expands its maritime empire with astonishing impunity. China's model represents a more successful expansionist threat than Russia's because it has mastered the art of winning without fighting. To do so, China hasn't relied solely on gray zone tactics at sea. It combines these tools with a highly sophisticated political warfare machinery that targets democratic weaknesses. Beijing enlists local adversaries to carry its message of China's inevitability, American retreat, and the futility of resistance, so that governments will eventually make business decisions to accommodate Beijing's demands. The goals are complementary: a steady erosion of the will to contest China's ambitions, and gradual acceptance of a new normal, one of Chinese regional supremacy. In the Philippines, we can see this clearly. Even as the world's bravest Coast Guard routinely faces extreme danger at sea from China's paramilitary ships, CCP acolytes organize lavish events ashore through United Front-linked organizations, assembling business and civic leaders to normalize CCP positions. It recruits and trains influencers through scholarships and other programs who then provide local voices for Chinese interests for broadcast on international media platforms. China's gray zone success exploits gaps in our national security bureaucracy, designed as that bureaucracy was against historical conventional threats. Beijing identifies strategic features, establishes presence through ostensibly civilian means, then escalates through its maritime militia and Coast Guard and backed by military force, all while maintaining the fiction of a peacefully rising China persecuted by local provocations. Our window to act is not just closing, it's vanishing. Beijing is even now consolidating recent gains and turning toward new objectives. We urgently need a comprehensive national counter-ICAD strategy that coordinates diplomatic, informational, economic, legal, cyber, and security instruments to meet this challenge. This strategy must also learn from the Philippines example and creatively integrate assertive transparency as a core tool, proactively collecting and rapidly releasing evidence that systematically exposes China's gray zone aggressions to deny it the cover of opacity and deniability upon which it has built its campaign. We must repurpose agencies like the U.S. Agency for Global Media to counter political warfare. Establish a development assistance program explicitly focused on building resilience against gray zone tactics, and mobilize our defense innovation ecosystem against this threat. Only a unified and well-resourced national effort can prevent China's gray zone successes from becoming irreversible precedents. But to win, we must first get our team on the field and organize for this campaign, the one we are already in. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Let me begin by commending your strong bipartisan leadership to advance U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific. This is desperately needed and more important than ever. As I've testified before, our stakes in the competition with China are enormous. And yet, despite significant progress, the United States is still not addressing the challenge with the level of urgency, attention, or resources it demands. This is also true in the gray zone, where U.S. policy is too often risk-averse, reactive, and inconsistent. My fellow witnesses today have done a great job describing and assessing China's ICAD behavior. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll spend the balance of my time on the question of what we should do about it, highlighting a few recommendations from my written testimony for how Congress can help shape a new approach to this critical challenge. First, we can and should do more to strengthen our allies. It is profoundly in America's interest to have partners who can provide frontline defenses against China's coercion. When our allies are more capable, they can do more on their own, they can contribute more to our collective defense, and in doing so, they can help to strengthen deterrence and reduce the costs and risks shouldered by U.S. forces. This is why the Trump administration, tactics aside, is doing the right thing by urging our partners to spend more on defense. But many of them can't do it entirely on their own, whether in the case of the Philippines or the Pacific Islands. And even though we acknowledge that China is our primary challenge, U.S. security assistance still does not reflect that reality, including major programs such as U.S. foreign military financing. Going forward, Congress can lead in correcting this imbalance by ensuring that U.S. support, both in scale and focus, reflects this prioritization of the China challenge. Second, this is especially true when it comes to Taiwan, where China's gray zone activities are growing more intense by the day. To be frank, I'm concerned that the current direction of U.S. policy is reducing U.S. support for Taiwan and undermining America's commitment to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Congress can lead by advancing an all-of-the-above strategy for Taiwan's defense and resilience that uses the full set of tools available, consistent with and reaffirming our commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act. That should include timely foreign military sales, foreign military financing, presidential drawdown authority, and support for Taiwan's defense industrial base. Mr. Chairman, we also have work to do here in Washington to compete more effectively in the gray zone, and that starts with crisis preparedness. The administration needs to be ready with concrete options for specific contingencies, such as a blockade of Second Thomas Shoal, a military overflight of Taiwan, or a maritime incursion close to Taiwan's shores. These could include rapid U.S. military deployments, coordinated responses with our allies, or pre-authorized sanctions packages. Congress should use its full authorities, including briefings, hearings, and legislation, to ensure that preparation is real and ongoing. Finally, as you heard from my colleagues today, we have more to do to compete in the information domain. Information operations are central to China's gray zone strategy, used to amplify its strengths, obscure its predatory activities, and shape global narratives to its advantage. Each year, China's government spends billions of dollars on state propaganda and overseas influence operations. And yet, to our own disadvantage, U.S. policy in this space is nearly non-existent. Instead, we should be proactively exposing, documenting, and publicizing China's illegal and coercive activities. Doing so can deter malign behavior, dilute the effectiveness of China's actions, and strengthen the resolve of partner governments to resist. To that end, Congress should lead an effort to build new U.S. institutions equipped and resourced to compete with China in the information domain. Otherwise, this prevailing gap will remain one of the most significant shortcomings in America's ability to meet the China challenge, both in the gray zone and more broadly. Mr. Chairman, those are just a few of the recommendations from my written testimony. Thank you again for your leadership, and I look forward to your questions.
A few years ago, when I visited Australia with Senator Warner, who was chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and Angus King, and also another member of the Intelligence Committee, I was struck by the fact that, talking to Australian parliamentarians, that the assumption that I had made that Australia would join in any collective defense of Taiwan that the United States was involved in just as a matter of course. But because of the politics in their own country, the diaspora of Chinese in Australia, it caused me to question who might join us in that effort. Mr. Singleton, who can we rely on besides ourselves?
It's a great question, and I think what the PRC is doing is actively exploiting all the cleavages amongst the democracies to sow doubt on this question. I personally believe that in the event of a Taiwan contingency, Canberra would step up, but it will largely depend on the political calculus in Canberra at the time, the makeup of its government, and of course, the Chinese get a vote and the leverage that they can employ over the Australians and all of our partners, frankly. I would put the most bang for my buck on the Japanese. I think we've seen real shifts in strategy, rhetoric, and resource allocation in Japan. The election of a new, very hawkish Japanese prime minister is an excellent sign. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I suspect this will come down to U.S. power and U.S. pressure in the region.
Mr. Powell, do you have a different view, Dr. Ratner?
I do not. I completely agree with Mr. Singleton. I was the U.S. Defense Attaché to Australia from 2017 to 2020. I used to, when I would brief our incoming delegations, I would often remind them that Australia is, despite all of our experience on the military side, is not the 51st state and does not necessarily sign up to everything that we decide to do, even though that they have been extraordinarily consistent in supporting U.S. operations throughout the decades. I think that one of the things we often forget is that when we are engaged in our own internal public discourse, that the world watches and that they are also, in many cases, democracies. And so it's very important that we sort of calibrate our rhetoric so that we bring them in rather than sort of find reasons to sort of cleave them off. So it's very important, I think, that we sometimes, when we're talking out loud, remember that the Australian people are listening.
Dr. Ratner, let me withhold that answer from you because that time is limited and I want to get back to all of you on another important topic. few years ago, as a result of COVID, we realized how dependent we are on extended supply chains of critical technology. For example, advanced semiconductors. And it occurred to me, and not just me alone, but many of us, that another pandemic, another war, another natural disaster would be disastrous to the United States in terms of our access to advanced semiconductors that we need for virtually everything, including our weapons. So I wanted to ask about our dependency on China for processing of critical minerals. 90% of the world's critical minerals are processed in China. They use that as enormous leverage. And while we did plus up the Office of Strategic Capital and the Development Finance Corporation and the Working Families Tax Cut Act, otherwise known as the One Big Beautiful Bill, how should we use that leverage those authorities and that funding to counter PRC's dominance when it comes to critical mineral processing? We'll start with you, Mr. Singleton.
Sure, I would just add that the late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping said that the Middle East has oil, but China has rare earths, and they've shown a willingness to weaponize it in the last year. I think this gets back to your last question. Where are our partners? The Australians are a natural partner here. They're a mining superpower. The Japanese have capital, and they have connections in countries like Malaysia, where President Trump is getting ready to go in a few weeks. We should be signing deals in this space aggressively, thinking about capital pooling, but also offload agreements. And I think it just represents a tremendous opportunity for enhancing alliance cohesion in the region.
Let me ask Dr. Ratner, do you have a view?
I would agree with Mr. Singleton and just say that, look, we need to build secure supply chains with our allies and partners, not closing ourselves off from the rest of the world.
On my frequent travels to the Indo-Pacific, the PRC's coercive and aggressive tactics are never far from the forefront. 2 years ago, I met with the Philippine Coast Guard just as we were delivering the first Black Hawk helicopter to them that was eagerly anticipated and had been put to use. They had endless examples of videos of the wildly aggressive actions coming from the PRC, and those actions have only continued to escalate. We've seen the PRC weaponize the tourism industry and sow disinformation to try to destabilize their neighbors. This is all part of their playbook, and we all recognize it. Illinois soybean farmers are feeling it today, too, as they're being screwed over amid the Trump tariffs, bearing the brunt of some very real pain right now. So having co-led repeated bipartisan delegations to the Shangri-La dialogue in recent years, I know that there is strong appetite for continued United States commitment to the region, particularly as a Pacific power ourselves. And we all know that in our absence, the PRC will fill that vacuum and exploit every loophole that they can find, with energy dependencies being another obvious target. And we can project our power militarily, and we must continue to show up for our allies and partners to keep proving that capability. But I feel very strongly that we have to show up on other fronts, too. And I believe there's a bipartisan interest in doing so, especially on the energy front. Mr. Singleton, you've discussed this already. How Taiwan's energy dependency is an acute and severe vulnerability. Can you elaborate on your recommendations and specific steps to the that the United States should take to ensure LNG supply flows remain stable and accessible? And no, Senator Sullivan did not pay me to say that. What about what about other sources of energy? Because I've had this conversation with the Taiwans themselves. Thank you.
No, absolutely. It's wonderful to see you again, ma'am. Energy is Taiwan's soft underbelly. There is no doubt about it. Taiwan has one of the most taxed grids of any OECD country. In the recent TTXs, and this is a fair warning for any think tanker that wants to go against the senator in a think tank or a war game, she had my number as the PRC in Move 1, so that was pretty frightening. But we realized pretty quickly that the Chinese were going to leverage low-level administrative and lawfare tactics to start to require permission for LNG tankers to cross the strait. You keyed in immediately on the disinformation component with the cyber element as well, and it was designed to create societal panic, to force hard choices in Taiwan between powering households or powering industry. Mm-hmm. And it cost me as China very, very little. I think obviously we need to be pressuring Taiwan's key suppliers, including Qatar, that if they do try to cut off Taiwan, that they face some pretty serious consequences from the U.S. Taiwan has to do its part. They need to be thinking about restarting mothballed nuclear facilities. They need to be thinking about purchasing their own LNG tanker fleet. That's something where we can help them with. But we also can help them fast track the purchase of U.S. LNG, which is something they would like to do, as well as invest in infrastructure projects, expanded terminals, emergency storage. That will all encourage resilience measures that I think would enjoy broad bipartisan support on Capitol Hill.
Thank you. So the United States military presence is not only an essential tool for regional defense, but also a fundamental element for proactive engagement and power projection, deterring the PRC from increasingly trying out their luck. We have a number of critical alliances and partnerships in the region. That we don't have to go it alone has always been one of our distinct advantages over the PRC in the Indo-Pacific. That commitment has to be a two-way street, and our allies have to trust that we will actually show up and be there when the time comes. But that trust has been shaken this year. Mr. Powell, given your expertise on gray zone tactics, what strategies should the United States adopt to facilitate a coordinated approach with our Indo-Pacific partners in addressing the PRC's territorial claims and broader regional influences?
Senator Duckworth, thank you for the question. One particular one that I've already mentioned in my opening comment, and which we've spent a lot of time on, is studying very hard what the Philippines has done with assertive transparency. Now, assertive transparency is a term that we developed at Sealight. The Philippines itself doesn't use that exact term, but the systematic exposure, documentation, and release of information about gray zone tactics pulls back the curtain of China's opacity and deniability that they use to conduct their gray zone activities. In short, I think we should light up the gray zone.
Thank you. And can we replicate these strategies around the world? What can you say about specific regional concerns that we should bear in mind here?
Well, so that's, I think, one reason why it's important to also bring in outside actors. Now, I recognize as an outside actor involved in the transparency space, there's a little self-interest here. But I think one of the reasons that Sealight exists is because we recognize that it's actually very hard for governments to release information due to security, political, diplomatic, all kinds of different, just bureaucratic reasons. So I think it needs to be a combination of aggressively doing things like declassifying information, releasing information from government sources, which have the best information, but also bringing in private actors that actually bypass the government bureaucracies so that you can kind of have all hands on deck.
Thank you. I have a final question, may I? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging me. I think looking forward, there are many steps that the United States should take to mitigate the PRC's illegal and coercive actions in the Indo-Pacific, but we also have to ensure that we keep open both diplomatic and financial channels with our partners to help them close their deficiencies. For instance, again, we talked about enhancing Taiwan's baseload energy options. Previous administrations' efforts to mitigate the immediate PRC threat to Taiwan have worked. Yet the Trump administration is withdrawing U.S. influence at a time when we actually need to show the PRC we remain with our friends. Dr. Ratner, what specific steps should the United States take to demonstrate its long-term commitment to the Indo-Pacific and its allies? And what are immediate and key components that need to be addressed? And how can we reconcile those needs with this administration's retreat from our longstanding commitments?
Well, thank you, Senator Duckworth. I mean, clearly, I think we've heard from the chairman and ranking member as well as the witnesses today that we do need what we call a whole-of-government strategy that includes military operations and military support and assistance and being with our allies, as you suggest, but it's much more than that. We need our State Department rallying the international community in support of our allies. During the previous administration, when the PRC would engage in these kind of activities against the Philippines, there would be a chorus of over a dozen countries around the world speaking out about the dangers and the unacceptability of that behavior. So that's quite important. We need development assistance to be strengthening the resilience of our partners, helping with their economic development. We need the information part of this equation more clear to get the message out to the region, and we need to think about legal tactics to be pushing back on China as well. I will add one other thing, Senator Duckworth, in the context of your original question to Mr. Singleton about energy, which is that the PRC has its own energy vulnerabilities, and they've been doing a lot to try to patch those up, but they're not there yet. Their energy consumption is only increasing, and they have major vulnerabilities in that regard, just like they have major vulnerabilities politically, diplomatically, in the information space, with trade, finance, and economics. And we need to be much more strategic about how we're not just playing defense and trying to put Band-Aids on our own allies and partners, but rather thinking about how do we layer our strengths with our allies and partners against China's weaknesses and vulnerabilities to create opportunities of advantage to start pushing back on this. There are a number of places to do that. I don't think we've done that effectively yet, and we need to be willing to ask hard questions. It doesn't mean regime change. It doesn't mean we're going to take actions that are going to undermine the livelihood of the Chinese people, but there are very much clear things we can do to push back on the regime in Beijing that we haven't done yet, and we ought to change that.
Thank
Given the range of tactics, you mentioned obviously energy being Taiwan's in particular soft underbelly, but what tactic do you think, or what has the Chinese ICAD activities that has been the most effective?
I think that what's fascinating about what they're sort of executing is that all of it is very self-reinforcing, and I think Mr. Powell hit on this in his testimony. Enhanced and expanded military operations around Taiwan in particular feed into a political warfare messaging that you see that's intended to sort of wear them down. And I think there's a psychological effect to this, that over time it becomes clear that time is on China's side, that there is no other choice. It's a fait accompli. I think it's the use of psychological warfare that is unique and distinct from our model of soft power that we haven't actually sort of contextualized, and we haven't built the tools and resources today to wage war with it. We did in the past, though. There's muscle memory from the Soviet Union when we went against Soviet active measures. I think we need to sort of dust off that playbook and start to think about how we can play in the sandbox here as well. I think Ray's point about sunlight is the best disinfectant is a cliche, but I think it's particularly important as we talk about Chinese political warfare.
Yeah. Ms. Powell, you talked about the need for a strategy. Can you explain just broadly, like, what would a strategy look like? What is, when you say strategy, help us understand specifically what you mean we should be doing.
Chairman Ricketts, thank you. I think it begins with having somebody whose responsibility it is to organize the campaign, right? So part of our problem is that we haven't, I spent 35 years in the world's greatest military. It's also the world's biggest bureaucracy, and it is primarily built around a hard power problem. As a 35-year military veteran, I can tell you that in many ways this is not a military problem. It is a whole of government problem, a whole of society problem. And whose job is that? I mean, is it there's somebody on the National Security Council who's taking this on and saying, how do we wage a successful campaign against an ICAD enemy? And one of the things I think that, I know, Chairman, that you have chosen the term ICAD over gray zone. I actually sort of use both interchangeably, in part because I think that both are helpful for different reasons. And in the gray zone case, I use it because China knows how to fill in all of those gaps in our bureaucracy. So however it is that we're organized, they will organize a counter-campaign utilizing their sort of fusion, their civil-military fusion organization to sort of push into the gaps. And so we need somebody whose job it is to build the counter-ICAD strategy and then to get everybody together. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what all the elements of the strategy is. Obviously, I'm very much a fan of the tactic of assertive transparency, but I think it's going to take some extremely deep thinking to figure that out.
Great. Dr. Ratner, obviously you've spent a lot of time in government. Can you tell us a little bit about when you were in government, what did those strategic options to respond to ICAD look like, and what are some concrete things that we ought to be thinking about?
Well, Senator Ricketts, it relates to the point in my opening statement about preparedness, because one of the things that we did do when I was at the Defense Department with the interagency was, in fact, to do a huge number of scenario planning, a lot of which was organized by the National Security Council, so included economic measures and development measures as well, and actually built a whole set of options around potential contingencies and then associated with them U.S. policy options up against escalatory ladders of actions the PRC could take. So I think that's really important work, and that ought to continue, but that wasn't addressing what we were seeing on a day-to-day basis. And I would again reflect back on the comment in my opening statement that I think, frankly, as a government, we have been too risk-averse. We ought not be, pig-headed in terms of or overly aggressive in terms of our reactions to get into some escalatory spiral to the PRC, but I don't think we're in danger of that. And what we have been in danger of is self-deterrence and not at all testing what I would describe as the elasticity of decision-making in Beijing, because they themselves are also quite risk-averse against getting into a conflict with the United States. And as I look back on the last couple decades that I've had the opportunity to work in the State Department, at the Defense Department, in the White House, up here on the Hill, there are very few instances where when the United States asserted itself with American power, with our allies, and with conviction and commitment, that Beijing then becomes and tries to escalate against that. That has not happened very much. So what we need to do, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait, whether it's in the South China Sea, is to start pushing back in a way with our power and conviction and allies that, again, test that risk aversion in Beijing as well. And I don't think we've done that sufficiently yet.
Would you agree with Mr. Powell that it maybe starts by putting one person in charge of designing the strategy to combat it?
I think that would help. In the previous administration, there certainly were single individuals in the National Security Council that were in charge of doing that around particular issues, whether it was the Taiwan issue set or the South China Sea issue set. Whether we need someone regionally, I think that's a good question, but I think I have seen the process working pretty well when there is a single individual around an issue set, yes. The proposal that I had put forward was for a Pacific Defense Pact, a collective defense pact between the United States, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. The rationale for it is, look, the defining national security question of our time is how we prevent PRC aggression in the Western Pacific in their ambitions to revise the Indo-Pacific order and the international order. The consequences of that, as you well know, would be terrible for the United States and terrible for the world. If we do that as a team sport with our allies and partners, it will, number one, be more effective, and number two, come at lower cost and lower risk to U.S. forces. It is a win-win for the United States. We have great alliances with those three countries. We have good partnerships around the region, but those alliances are not connected with each other. And the question before us then is, how do we make the whole greater than the sum of the parts as it relates to our alliances, and how do we create structures so that we can actually operate together, deter together, fight together as necessary? And the fact of the matter is, whether we like it or not, today we are not prepared to fight as a collective with our allies and partners. We do not have the command and control we need. We do not have the plans we need. We do not have the force posture we need. We are not operating together in the way that we need to. So we need institutions that bring together these countries to get prepared in that fashion. And what I put forward was a proposal to do exactly that.
Well, thank you. I was struck at Indo-PACOM at the senior level at which Australian military flag officers are integrated into the Indo-PACOM, both planning and command and control. And I do think the Japanese have stepped up dramatically in terms of their defense investment and defense posture. And Korea, over the last decade, has steadily increased its posture, but I couldn't agree more. It's not coordinated, and it doesn't have interlocking security. Mr. Powell, if I might, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons, thank you. On your question of coordination, how to build essentially the institution, I think we have to start domestically, in part because, I mean, right now, the way that we are putting out policy, geopolitics is just, it seems to be kind of a minor part of the overall understanding of, so we have things coming out of Treasury and Commerce and all kinds of different parts of the government that seem to be disaggregated from the larger strategic problems. And so I do think that there needs to be somebody at a very senior level whose job it is to think about these things and how they are working toward victory, or at least, competing in this space. A second, on the question of whether we should build new agencies or repurpose the ones that we have, I think, right now, as many things have been defunded or even dismantled, the question being, whether we're talking about USAID or USAGM or any of these things, recognizing that there actually was an intent behind those things, however well it was being carried out. And maybe taking this moment to say, well, how do we either build something new or repurpose this thing so that it is fighting this fight that we're in right now? Because the idea of, okay, we don't like this tool in the toolbox, so we're just going to remove it. Well, yeah, but what are we going to put back in the toolbox? Because maybe the new problem, the old tool didn't fit very well, so let's make a new tool. Or even if we can just clean up the old tool and make it work better. And then finally, I hate to be a one-note Nancy on this, but I really do think that transparency has, and again, this idea of assertive transparency has a lot to be said for it because it is the thing that helps build democratic resilience. If you look at the Philippines, where were they before they began their assertive transparency program in early 2023? Their primary strategy was built around the problem of counterterrorism. They were basically asleep to what was happening in the West Philippine Sea. Where are they today? Their people are motivated. They're holding their lawmakers accountable. They've completely remade their strategy, so it's focused on archipelagic defense. They are investing in their Coast Guard, in their Navy, in their Air Force, and they are reaching out to a lot of allies and making their own allies and partners. They're extremely aggressively putting together, and they're doing this because in a democracy, you need the support of the people, and in order to get the support of the people, you have to show them why, and that's what they've done.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think the first step is we have to articulate our desired end states in the region, which we haven't done. And then you have to catalog the players who are involved. I think when we think both domestically and internationally, it's clear that not every partner is going to do the same thing, but every partner has to do something. The first step, of course, is we need to talk more openly with our partners and our allies about the Taiwan challenge in particular, but I would also add what's happening in the South China Sea. Too often these conversations are happening in private. We need to start to talk about them in public, and that forces, I think, hard political decisions both here and abroad about what we're actually willing to do to push back on Chinese ICAD behavior. It's vital that we have at least some centralized decision-making in our government about this. In the Cold War, we had individuals at the National Security Council specifically tasked with combating these sorts of activities. Those people don't exist anymore and haven't for some time. The other thing we have to do, obviously, is resource it, where Congress comes into play, and then hold the administration, regardless of who's in power, accountable for those decisions and allocations. But all of that starts with identifying what is our desired end state in the region, and frankly, multiple administrations haven't really done that very well.
We were talking about energy a little bit earlier, about being the soft underbelly of Taiwan. The island imports 98% of its energy. I think it's 42 days of coal it has on hand. I think you said 10, maybe it's 11 days of natural gas. You mentioned that they should dust off some of their mothballed nuclear facilities. Senator Coons and I had a table talks exercise that we led with several of our colleagues to go through this with you. The scenario underscored how quickly an embargo or a blockade could escalate into a crisis, and highlighted some of these things. And that's why we introduced the Taiwan Energy Security and Anti-Embargo Act to help strengthen Taiwan's energy resilience. Based upon that tabletop exercise that you facilitated in May, and then as you've said, you've done in other places as well, what are some of the key lessons that stand out and some of the concrete steps that we ought to be taking to be able to strengthen Taiwan's energy resilience?
No, thank you for the question. I think my key takeaway was just how easy it was for the PRC to exert a little bit of pressure and achieve the desired end state that it was hoping for, which was societal panic. Obviously, I think some of the key provisions we need to be thinking about are helping Taiwan with energy diversification. We have lots of LNG here. You're right, it's 10 days of storage there. We need to be thinking about how we can fast track and sign long-term deals, offload agreements with the Taiwanese. They want to buy our LNG. They want to diversify away from countries like Qatar. What can we do to sort of fast track that? And then encourage greater integration, I think, with some of the trusted suppliers, including countries like Australia on the coal side. We can help them with things like strategic stockpiling. We can help them build up emergency energy reserves, particularly in the coal space. We want to expand, and I think Dr. Ratner used a great term, sort of elongate and expand the sort of deterrence rubber band, if you will, here to think beyond 10 days. How many more days can we build in to build redundancy? Critical infrastructure resilience in Taiwan is a massive problem. We need to think about hardening their energy infrastructure. That includes LNG terminals and pipelines and power grids and ports, making them sort of to inoculate them against some of the cyber operations and disruptions that the PRC is orchestrating. And we have to do this with the private sector. I think one of the key takeaways that from both the exercise we did with the committee, but also foreign capitals, was how much the insurance risk market plays in here, and whether it's thinking about reflagging operations or potential convoy operations to break a quarantine or a blockade, but also to think about war-backed insurance that could be provided in the event of a contingency through U.S. and allied partners to ensure that transit of commercial goods and LNG continues to flow. Again, there are historical precedents for all of these things, particularly in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan and the Iran-Iraq War. We just have to dust off the history and get that muscle memory back.
Now, you also mentioned that China has its own vulnerabilities. What are some specific steps that we could do that would remind Communist China that they've got vulnerabilities as well?
Let's not forget that the Chinese are almost wholly dependent on their food needs from other countries. These are countries where the United States has tremendous diplomatic leverage. Dr. Ratner mentioned energy vulnerabilities. These are pretty severe and intense for the Chinese. But also we have to remember that the Chinese economy is currently in a state of disarray. We have exceptionally low growth. We have an economic model that's running on fumes and an economic model that's highly vulnerable to sanctions. I think sanctions signaling is so important. I saw that Chairman Risch introduced a bill, I think, today on that very topic. We need to make clear to the Chinese that specific Chinese state-owned entities and banks could become targets of U.S. financial sanctions in the event that they pursue a quarantine operation. And I think that that would seriously challenge China's calculus.
Senator Sullivan has a bill that would spell out the sanctions that would happen in a Taiwan contingency. Do you think that putting those down in writing, passing a bill, is something that is helpful in deterring Communist China, or is that giving away our playbook?
I don't think it gives away our playbook. I think consistency in messaging is essential. It forms one of those, part of the three-legged stool, right? Consistent messaging, credible capacity, which is, I think, an area where the Biden administration really excelled. And we also have to be thinking about these coordinated countermeasures. That three-legged stool, I would say there are opportunities to really harden it and do so through legislation, but also very clear signaling to the PRC that this is not costless. And I think today, the challenge, of course, is that the Chinese are increasingly becoming overconfident, and that could lead to miscalculation.
So if we were able to pass a sanctions bill such as Senator Sullivan has, what about getting our allies on board? You've all stressed the importance of our allies, and I agree it's the strategic competitive advantage we have that the PRC will never have. So how do we work with our allies on something that would be involved in sanctions?
I think it takes work. It takes engagement, of course. I'm reminded of the excellent work that the Biden administration actually did on unifying export controls on the PRC. Tarun Chhabra, in particular at the NSC, was flying around the world convincing all of our friends and allies to exert tool controls on the Chinese to slow down semiconductor manufacturing and tool design and chip design. We can mirror that same, piggyback on that same model, I think, by convincing partners and allies that we're all going to do this together, that it's a unified sanctions framework, and that there will probably have to be some select carve-outs in certain cases.
And then encouraging our allies like Japan and Australia to pass similar bills?
Whether they pass certain bills or there's just a commitment in kind to follow what we do, I think that signaling alone really seeds doubt into China's decision-making calculus, and then they're forced to contend with whether they can continue to sustain a war against Taiwan or continue to fund certain parts of its military modernization.
Let me just follow along in that line, Mr. Singleton. I do think that one of the things we need to keep thinking and working and legislating around is how do we make Xi Jinping's morning ritual, not today, not this week, not this month, and having a common approach to pre-signaling about the price that will be imposed on China, China's leadership, China's economy in exchange for their activities against Taiwan helps deter. Senator Risch in particular, but a number of other colleagues felt that if we had been more active and clear and aggressive in signaling to Putin the price he would pay for invading Ukraine, we might have deterred Putin's invasion of Ukraine or full spectrum, large-scale invasion since he initially invaded in 2014. What's your assessment of what scale and coordination of signaling around price would actually be most effective?
It's a great question. I actually think that some of the research that Bonnie Lin has done at CSIS on gray zone responses is super helpful here. The longer that you delay a response to gray zone aggression, you have to have a more outsized response to reestablish sort of a deterrent baseline. I think as I sort of think about the PRC, I agree with Dr. Ratner. We're talking about a particularly risk-averse regime that is usually inward focused, and I think very cognizant in their own discourse about their own limitations and weaknesses. I think us very cleanly mapping all of their dependencies and all of their vulnerabilities and starting to signal where we have leverage, whether it's in the tech space. I certainly think the economic space is one that's not been sort of addressed cohesively. Again, it just forces the Chinese to start to account for all of these potential complications that will make something that is already probably the most consequential and difficult invasion known to mankind even less likely. But then you can't discount what we're seeing in the gray zone space and the silent subjugation and I think sort of the ramping up of activity there, such that we want to buy time and slow them down. I think it's probably what we need to internalize as our strategy. Anything that does and accomplish that objective, I think should be get a fair shake.
Mr. Powell, last month, the PRC announced a new national nature preserve at the Scarborough Shoal that would create a protected area around a whole coral reef ecosystem. Philippine officials have called this another PRC land grab. Could you just briefly walk through the impact of this designation and how it relates to a broader pattern of lawfare tactics designed, again, below the threshold of military aggression to expand PRC control in the South China Sea?
Yes, Senator Coons, this is a great question. And I think, as most of us know, the PRC campaign for Scarborough Shoal really began in 2012 when it basically took effective control of access to Scarborough Shoal. And then last year, actually, early in the year, what we saw was kind of a remarkable sequence of events. There was an expansion of Chinese paramilitary activity, and I classify China Coast Guard and Maritime Militia as a paramilitary force, in part because I think it's very important for us to realize that we don't have a paramilitary force, which is part of why we don't have a good response to these assets. So they began to deny Philippine access in a much more aggressive way early last year. They also sent in a scientific expedition to take a look at the condition of the shoal, and two things happened. One is that they immediately banned their giant clam harvesting fleet, which all disappeared around June of last year, indicating that they probably found out that giant clam harvesting, which is extraordinarily destructive, had done great damage to the shoal. And second, they issued a report that said the condition of the shoal is great. So we then saw they also established straight baselines around the shoal, essentially marking it out as territory. And so this establishment of a nature preserve is sort of an environmental overlay onto that, essentially land grab at this point. So we can see all of these things working together: the establishment of effective control, the lawfare, the administrative control, all of these things, and the denial of Philippine access. And in fact, Senator, I will also say that the collision that we observed in August was in part a result of this establishment of effective control, because the Philippine ship that got in close to the shoal, I think got in a lot closer than China expected, which was what drew in the destroyer, which almost caused that mutual defense treaty triggering event that we all fear. So it's part of a larger campaign. And one last thing, just on top of what Mr. Singleton has said about Taiwan and what we've all been talking about. I'm one, because I've been looking at this in the South China Sea so long, I don't actually expect to see a large-scale quarantine or blockade or anything like that. I'd be more afraid of what would start happening if all of a sudden China announced that it was going to enact a new safety regime for LNG ships inbound to Taiwan and begin to say turn around one and then maybe another one. And again, that would be much more in line with the ICAD kind of campaign that they've been waging.
I agree with you that, look, we need to plan for and prepare for the possibility of a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, but doctrine, history, preparedness, risk aversion strongly suggests that they're much more likely to engage in the kind of creeping, steady, aggressive behavior that you were just describing, and that allows them to assert sovereignty over a greater and greater area of the region. A last question, if I might. Dr. Ratner, you've talked about how past U.S. policy has been overly reactive to PRC actions. What would a more proactive U.S. government approach ideally look like, given where we are today and looking forward, given your experience?
Well, I guess I would, as I mentioned in my written testimony, I think there are a couple ways to think about this. One is at the tactical and operational level, and then another is at the strategic level. I think at the tactical level, as we've talked about, there are things we can be doing operationally to be doing our own salami slicing back. There are new emerging defense technologies, autonomy, low-cost, attritable systems that we can be using ourselves and providing to our partners for them to get out on the water and start asserting their claims instead of just defending against PRC incursions. There are things we can be doing on the development and assistance front to try to get ahead of the very likely forms of political influence operations, cyber intrusions that we know the PRC is conducting. Again, we talked about the information domain, so there are ways to get after this. But I guess what I would say one thing I think we have to remember as we think about this issue set is when we see the PRC doing something out at Second Thomas Shoal or out at Scarborough Shoal, those very specific tactical features and locations are important, but they're part of a bigger story, which is China's ambitions to control the South China Sea, to control the East Asian littoral. What we need to be doing in response and in parallel to China's ICAD activities is not just playing whack-a-mole, though we should be out there defending their tactical moves, but rather thinking about what are the strategic actions we need to be taking to ensure that they can't, in the end, have that kind of effective control that they want. So with the Philippines, for instance, yes, we need to be supporting them out at Scarborough Shoal, but we ought to be working on our force posture in the Philippines. We ought to be expanding the number of locations we're investing in. We ought to be investing a lot more in those locations to develop them. We should be bringing more advanced capabilities into those locations. We should be operating more and more with our allies and partners, the Australians and the Japanese, who both have reciprocal access agreements now with the Philippines. They can be operating and supporting these EDCA sites as well. They can be contributing development assistance that are connecting roads to our military sites. So when we pick up our heads